Mr. Calkins, seconded by Mr. Hahn, moves that Bill S-213, an act respecting a National Day of Remembrance to honor Canadian veterans of the Korean War, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Veterans Affairs. Debate. The Honourable Member for Wetaskiwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm certainly pleased to rise today and join my colleagues in support of Bill S-213, an act to establish the Korean War Veterans Day. If I may, I would like to offer special thanks to my colleague, the Honourable Yana Martin, a Senator, who has proposed this legislation, and thank her for her tireless work on this initiative and for bringing S-213 forward. I share her desire to recognize the thousands of Canadian men and women who have served our country and made a significant contribution to international peace and security. I would also like to thank our Minister of Veterans Affairs for declaring 2013 the year of the Korean War veteran. I was encouraged to hear that the Minister recently traveled with 36 veterans to South Korea on a commemorative trip. This Minister's work ensures that the Korean War will never be thought of again as the forgotten war. I stand alongside the Minister as he continues to stand up for Korean War veterans and all veterans. I would like to thank the representatives of the Korean War Veterans Association for their support of this legislation, and I can assure all members of this House that this government, more than any in recent history, is committed to giving every possible support to the members of the Canadian Armed Forces. We are also committed to ensuring Canadian veterans are treated with dignity and respect that they deserve, that they have brought honour to Canada, and we in turn will honour them. Mr. Speaker, on November 11th, Canadians pause to remember their brave countrymen and women who have given their all in the service of Canada. Through this national act of remembrance, we honour all veterans. We honour those who served in war and those who served in peace. We honour those who served in all theatres of war. We honour those who have served in Canada, helping our communities respond to and recover from natural disasters. We honour those who continue to stand for peace and freedom in operations all over the world, most recently in Afghanistan and Libya. Mr. Speaker, this legislation constitutes a specific recognition of those who served in the Korean War and who selflessly contributed to the peace and security of the Republic of Korea in the years following the armistice. The timing of this legislation is equally significant and appropriate. The year 2013 marks the 60th anniversary of the Korean War armistice, a milestone worthy of recognition and reflection. In fact, the Prime Minister has declared the year 2013 as the year of Korea in Canada, in part to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the Korean War armistice, as well as 50 years of formal diplomatic relations between our two great countries. The Minister of Veterans Affairs, as you know, followed the Prime Minister's lead by also declaring 2013 as the year of the Korean War veteran in his department. We are proud to honour Canada's veterans for what they've accomplished on land, at sea and in the air during the Korean War. That's why our government has presented certificates of recognition this year to Canadian Korean War veterans. We've worked in partnership with the Republic of Korea last month to have 36 Canadian vets of the Korean War revisit the battlefields where they had served. This trip was very important to these veterans, Mr. Speaker, and I will highlight Mr. Harry Marshall, a veteran of the Korean War, who said, "It is with many mixed emotions that I take this journey, but it is important to honour all those who served in this war 60 years ago." It is for these important reasons that the Minister of Veterans Affairs has promoted a full weekend to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the Korean War armistice in Ottawa at the end of June. The Korean War will always be an important chapter, a defining moment in our country's proud military history. It deserves special recognition, which is why I urge all members to support this proposed legislation to create a national day in honour of Korean War veterans. Mr. Speaker, with my remaining time, I would like to talk about the extraordinary service and sacrifice of Canada's veterans during the Korean War, and to begin by placing their efforts within a wider context. As we all know, the First and Second World Wars touched Canadians in every community across this great country. From the largest cities to the smallest towns, everyone knew someone who had served overseas, and too many had lost a loved one. Against the backdrop of those two great wars, the Korean War seemed a bit different. It was obviously shorter and smaller in scale, far fewer casualties. So how could it possibly compare with the global conflicts? How could it command Canadians' attention the way the First and Second World Wars had? The hindsight of historians has helped us to understand the importance of the Korean War, as well as its tragic impact on so many Canadian heroes and their families. We now understand how critical it was for Canada and 15 other nations to provide combat troops and halt the spread of tyranny and oppression. And I don't think there's anywhere other than the Korean Peninsula where that halt of oppression and tyranny is better shown in the world today. Bill S-213 will ensure we forever remember the courage and sacrifice of more than 26,000 brave Canadians who served during the Korean War, and the approximately 7,000 who continue to serve after the armistice was signed in 1953. Through Bill S-213, we can guarantee that future generations of Canadians will never make the same mistake of treating the Korean War as anything less than the devastating war that it actually was. Of course, Mr. Speaker, Canada's veterans of the Korean War have never forgotten. They've never forgotten the 516 Canadians who gave their lives in service during the Korean War, the 516 Canadians who made the ultimate sacrifice defending the right of all peoples to live in peace and freedom. They've never forgotten their comrades who were wounded in battle or the families forever changed by war. And they have never forgotten what they witnessed and endured, from the terrible human suffering to the terrifying violence and unending hardships. They remember the overwhelming odds they faced as they were greatly outnumbered on rugged and foreign terrain. They remember the local families fleeing from their homes with only what they could carry on their backs, young children following, hungry and scared. They remember the atrocities, the executions, the purges and massacres that also left countless civilians dead. In short, Mr. Speaker, Canada's veterans know the brutal truth about the Korean War. They are our clearest window into a great tragedy, and sadly the passage of time is taking its toll on these Canadian heroes. Only about 10,600 of Canada's Korean veterans remain. Most of them are in their 80s, or at least very close. We have an urgent duty as a nation to preserve their stories and to ensure future generations actively remember. The Minister of Veterans Affairs has taken a very active role in ensuring that Canadians are educated about the sacrifices and stories of Korean War veterans. A national day to honour these veterans will help us do that. Korean War Veterans Day will inspire Canadians to explore our proud past and to learn more about the contributions and sacrifices of such a remarkable group of men and women. Mr. Speaker, when support came to the Republic of Korea's aid, in 1950, Canada responded in numbers exceeding what the world might have expected from our country with its relatively small population. What is equally amazing is that many of the Canadians who served in Korea had already served in the Second World War. They had already witnessed unspeakable horrors and experienced great personal loss. They already knew the terrible cost of freedom, and they were still willing to pay the price again. That is what made these seemingly ordinary Canadians so truly extraordinary. They willingly traveled halfway around the world to serve in a foreign land, a land unlike anything most of them had ever seen. I'm sure each one of them had his or her personal reasons for going, but I also believe they were united in their sense of purpose, and I am sure they would have echoed the words of statesman Edmund Burke, who once said, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." We can only guess at how the course of history may have been different if Canada and her allies had done nothing, if we had stood by and let evil triumph. Mr. Speaker, we can paint many different pictures of what life in Canada would be like today if the United Nations had not stepped in and if North Korea had not been stopped in its tracks. Quite frankly, it's possible we would not even be here in this chamber today as elected officials in a free and democratic country, if not for the courage of men and women who answered the world's call so many years ago. That is the legacy we have inherited from our soldiers, sailors, and flyers, nurses, doctors, and Aboriginal veterans who distinguished themselves in a far-off war. We are the direct beneficiaries of their service and bravery. We are only able to serve them here today because they served when Canada called upon them. We understand our debt in a very intuitive way, and that is why I'm so proud to support this bill. Mr. Speaker, I know I don't have much time left, but I want to just talk a little bit briefly about my own personal experience. I had the privilege last fall of going to Korea with a number of Canadian Korean War veterans and going to see the cemetery in Busan, the United Nations Cemetery, participate in a service with those veterans. And I could see, and from the stories that they told me, how much that experience meant to them. The government of Korea, Mr. Speaker, and the people of Korea have certainly never forgotten. In fact, when I went to the National War Museum in Korea, you could hear children laughing because it was required for so many young people to come through that museum and see what Canada and other countries had done. All of the names of every soldier that died in the Korean War are on placards outside, adorning the entranceway on various columns and pillars. Some 40,000 U.S. soldiers, and of course the 516 Canadians that passed away or died or were killed in action, and some 50 that died in service after the armistice was actually signed. Mr. Speaker, if you'll permit me, I also, the reason that I do this, and I'm very grateful for my colleague Senator Yona Martin for giving me this opportunity. I have in my hand, Speaker, and it's not a prop, I don't want anybody to get the notion that it is, but it's an obituary. It's an obituary that's been on the wall of my house that I've had an opportunity to read many times as a youngster growing up. And I'm doing this right now for my grandpa Don and my Calkins family. and it's going to be tough for me to read this. I'll do my best. Corporal James Alvin Calkins, 25, formerly of Rocky Mountain House, is the second Albertan to die in the Korean War. His parents, Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Calkins, received word from the Defense Department that he had died of wounds received in the battle. He served with the Lord Strathcona's Horse in the Second Great War, and for a time in the Reserve Army. On November 20th, 1950, he was sent with the 2nd Battalion of the Princess Patricias to train at Fort Lewis, Washington. He was a member of C Company. Surviving besides his parents are his two sisters, Miss Bertie Lloyd of Nordegg and Miss Jo Fredine of Rocky, two brothers, Joe of Rocky and Donald of Lacombe. Another brother, Robert, was killed in action in the Italian campaign. Mr. Speaker, there was many families touched by the Korean War, and the Calkins family was one of them. And I'm really glad to have the opportunity to present this bill in the House today, and I hope it has unanimous support of all my colleagues. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? La députée, questions et commentaires? Questions and comments? Reprise. Oh, the honourable member for Toronto Danforth.
I would simply like to thank our colleague for a heartfelt and indeed stirring speech. Personally, I myself wear a ring that was on my grandfather's hand when he lost his leg at the Battle of Drocourt-Quéant in 1918. And I'm well aware of the need to remember and honor our family members, but our fellow Canadians for what they've done over the decades for this country and indeed for the larger values that they fought for. Just wanted to make one link that the honourable member noted that the Korean War was actually mobilized through the United Nations. In that same decade, the 1950s, another great Canadian, Lester Pearson, helped also mobilize the United Nations to bring to an end the Suez Crisis. And I think at both events, what we did in the Korean War and what happened at Suez do deserve to be much better known by Canadians. And so I do thank the honourable member for bringing this forward. There's no particular question, it's just a comment. Thank you.
Well, member for Wetaskiwin.
Well, thank you, Speaker. I appreciate the comments of my honourable colleague. Look, the 1950s, the Korean War, with the United Nations action was a different time. It was a different era, and it took a lot of leadership from all of our allies that were over there. And I just want to thank my colleague for his personal input to this as well. It is a difficult thing for families and descendants of those families to deal with it. I'm several generations down, and it still affects me to this day for family members that I've never met and never will have the opportunity to meet. And I just wonder how many other family members I would have had had they been able to survive. And so it's with great pleasure that I accept his comments. And obviously, moving forward, we have to do everything we can as a nation to remind current and future generations of the tremendous sacrifice that was made by those who came before them, and this bill helps to do that, and I thank him for his support.
Hear, hear.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Simcoe Grey.
Well, thank you very much, and I want to thank the member for his comments today. Like himself, I have family members that had participated not in the Korean War, but in the Second World War, and obviously the sacrifice that not only those individuals but the families have made are utmost value to all Canadians. I'd like to ask the member if he could comment on how he and maybe even his other family members came to the decision that this is something that should be memorialized, that is why the focus for himself and his family, why this is so meaningful, not just to himself, but possibly to his children or maybe to his other family members, why he felt so passionately about bringing forward this private member's bill.
The honourable member for Wetaskiwin.
Well, thank you, Speaker, and thank my distinguished colleague for the question. Mr. Speaker, obviously, the personal link to me now to the Korean War is a matter of public record, and it's something that that I'm passionate about, simply because I don't think, and it's been well documented. I mean, it's called the Forgotten War, and I made comments to that in my speech. But I can tell you, for those who served in Korea and for those family members of those who served in Korea, it's not a forgotten war. And for too long, Canada brushed it aside as United Nations action. I think it was called policing action at the time, when the reality was it was all-out war on the Korean Peninsula. One only has to read a book by about the Korean War, for example, The Triumph of Kapyong by Daniel Bjarnson, which is a fantastic read if anybody has an opportunity to do that. You know, we had our Thermopylae in Korea, and it was called the Battle of Kapyong. I did a statement about it here a little while ago, where 700 Canadians, 2 PPCLI, the same regiment that my great uncle was a member of, stood in the face of thousands. Where all others had failed, 700 stood in the face of an onslaught of aggression by thousands and thousands of enemy soldiers, and they held their position for several days. And they were only a few kilometers north of Seoul, the current place where Seoul, Korea is. And you know, it's an absolute travesty that we haven't actually learned of the tremendous heroic measures that these guys were all volunteers that went over there, Mr. Speaker. They all volunteered and signed up for this, and they went over there and did yeoman service. And nowhere else in the world today is there a more distinct delineation between a triumph in a battle and what happens when you fail to preserve liberty and peace and freedom for individuals. And that is the stark contrast is no better displayed anywhere in the world today than the Korean Peninsula.